Welcome to everyone. I first want to say that this show has been an incredible opportunity, and I'm eternally grateful to Janie Herman, who saw my work on Twitter and decided that I should be one of the artists shown at the library, and to Maria Evans from the Arts Council of Princeton, both of whom were incredibly helpful in putting this all together. I also want to thank Shelley Krause, who is the person most responsible for getting me through the experience of having a concussion. My work is a reflection of the experience I had when in late April 2017 I passed out and for no apparent reason and got a severe concussion. And at the time I couldn't listen to music, I couldn't have bright lights, although I could go out in the sunshine, which was very interesting, and was told by the doctors that I couldn't read, look at screens, or do any complex thinking, which at the time kind of felt like a koan. Like, isn't thinking not to do complex thinking? But in trying to tell you the story about my art, I am reminded a little bit of an interview of Robert Frost in which someone asked him to explain one of his poems, and Robert Frost was a fairly cranky man, and he looked at the woman and said, "You want me to say it worse?" So I'm going to talk mostly about the process of what it was like to have the intersection of a concussion and finding my way into being a painter, but also finding my way through the concussion because of, or with the help of, painting. This first slide is to give you a little bit of a visual of what it was like at the very beginning in my concussion. This is my favorite cartoon. I always say that. My favorite comic strip, Phoebe and her unicorn. And Shelley and I had the idea that maybe she could read to me from Phoebe and her unicorn. And one of the most common things that people said to me when they found out I had a concussion was, well, how about books on tape? And my response to that was listening and perceiving a book through a book on tape is actually mentally more taxing than reading a book. And there was absolutely no way I could do books on tape. And in fact, when Shelley first started reading to me from Phoebe and her unicorn, I think the very first day we got through the first square of a strip. And I said, that's enough, I'm too tired. And then eventually we got to the point fairly quickly where I could listen to an entire strip, but rarely more than one strip, one day of Phoebe and her unicorn. And it became a kind of measure of the progress I was making as I went through the experience. I thought I would show you the last painting I did before my concussion. This was probably in 5th or 6th grade, I'm not exactly sure. And when I was cleaning out my parents' house, I found a copy of this. I found this painting and made a photograph of it. And what I remember most about that experience was how much I really liked. If you'd asked me what do I remember of the painting that I made in 5th or 6th grade, I would say I remember how much I liked how orange and gray looked together. And that was before I had any idea what Princeton University was or that the colors were orange and black. Over the years, I've been very engaged by the arts. I spent a good part of my teens and 20s and 30s seriously writing poetry. I effectively minored in the history of photography at Princeton and spent time taking studio photography courses and a lot of time photographing, as you can read about in my bio on my website. Also in the early 90s, at one of the courses in the Princeton Night School, I took a weaving class with Laura Lindenfeld, who is one of the great fiber artists of the 20th century, and that's what you're seeing in this slide. So what happened was, as Shelley and I and my friends were talking about what could I do with my time while I was home, not allowed to read, not allowed to look at screens, there was a little bit of brainstorming, no pun intended. So my friend Vivian said to me, well, maybe you could paint, and not just fit with this feeling I'd had that maybe I could make gestures. I couldn't go for walks. I couldn't go for walks on my own. I couldn't really do anything all that physical, but I felt like I could make gestures. And so that night, Shelley and I went out to, I think it was Michael's, and bought a pad of paper, an easel, and a starter set of tubes. And one of the things I remember about that night is I went into the store with her, which of course is a big open store with lots of fluorescent lights, and told her what I wanted, and then I said, I'll meet you outside. And I had to leave the store because the fluorescent lights had such an impact on how I felt, and I just couldn't bear them. And that's a very common impact from concussions, which is one of the reasons why it's particularly hard for kids who are in school who get concussions to go back to school very quickly, because schools are almost all lighted with fluorescent lights. And I ended up having to get special glasses that I wore when I went back to work, and wore a visor for months and months just to protect me a little bit from the fluorescent lights. But we got this set of paints, and I really just started kind of making daubs and trying to figure out how the paintbrushes worked and what I could do with the paint and how I could put colors together. And it was so thrilling. I look at these paintings now and they're very simple, but in my concussed state, they were so rewarding to make. And I came across recently this quote from Georgia O'Keeffe, who said, I found that I could say things with colors and shapes that I couldn't say in any other way, things that I had no words for. And when you have a concussion, finding words is very difficult, but being able to say things with paints just felt really natural. This is one of my favorite of the early paintings. It's called Sea Glass. You can't really tell so much. I could never get a great photograph of that felt accurate to me, to the colors in the painting. But I thought it ended up looking a lot like a tray full of sea glass. And I remember being on the telephone while I was making this painting, and having a friend call while I was making this painting, and I answered the phone and she said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm actually painting as we speak. And it was, as I said, just very simple exploration of what can a paintbrush do. So I want to go back a little bit in order to explain, some of the methods I developed as a painter. I have to go back a little bit to my childhood. I was profoundly impacted by the first Earth Day in 1970 and the idea of recycling things, of not throwing things away. I'm rather famous in my family for having made a Halloween costume entirely of those pop tops from beer and soda cans, because of course when I was a kid, when you took off the pop top, it actually came off of the can. And I spent an entire vacation at a campground collecting those little rings from the ground in the campground and saving them, taking the sharp strip part off, and then I think with twisty ties, I don't really remember, I made a chainmail costume for Halloween. And I also probably about a year later, created an entire dollhouse out of found and discarded materials. And you can see here the little saw that I made from some driftwood, and that strip that is on a box of waxed paper, a tricycle made with pipe cleaners and spools of thread, a little bunk bed that I made out of the box from the papers that you put in a muffin tin, and a little television with a bobby pin rabbit ears on it. And I don't know if any of you remember, in the 70s there were these chairs that looked kind of like this. Well, this chair on the screen it's on my right, was made out of a softball that someone had knocked the stuffing out of, literally. And I made little deck chairs out of some piece of plastic. I think now that I'm looking at it that the plastic was the framing that you pulled pieces out of to make a model car, which my brother and sister both had model car sets. So I tell you that story because what I started doing was figuring out ways to paint, not just with a paintbrush, but without a paintbrush. There are things I wanted to be able to do, and because of the tremor that I have in my hands, really fine lines are not an option for me. And this is a painting of a dream I had. I woke up, I don't know, early in the morning, middle of the night, however you want to describe it, and had this image and thought to myself, I need to keep this image in my mind because I want to paint it. And as soon as I got out of bed, I started going through cupboards and closets looking for something I could use to recreate the image that I had seen in my dream. And I think that's the square, sort of rounded square in there, is from a piece of Tupperware. This painting was made from an ice cream cup. It was a very heavy plastic cup that I'd gotten some ice cream in while on vacation, and it has this great flat edge to it around the rim. The rim is probably 1/4 of an inch at least wide, and makes a great tool for painting it and then painting with it. And I was a little bit triumphant because when I decided to bring that plastic cup home from vacation, my family said, really? You're going to fit that in your suitcase? You're going to bring... What are you going to do with that? Well, for a while we used it for serving berries and things like that, but it ended up being one of my favorite tools for painting. And as I started doing all these paintings where I was using the lids of things to make circles and make sort of scratching marks with paint, marks on paper using pieces of plastic, I ended up with the painting on the left, which I immediately thought of as my constructivist moment. And when I looked at it later on, I thought, oh my gosh, it looks like a Malevich. And because I studied both art and Russian history, I spent a good amount of time being exposed to the art of the early 20th century in the Soviet Union. So today I went back and found this Malevich painting, and so you can see that that's my baby Malevich on the left and an actual Kazimir Malevich painting on the right. I also used things like shampoo bottles. This painting was done by putting paint on the edge of a shampoo bottle and pressing that against the piece of paper. And I kind of alternated between freehand paintings and paintings where I was using various tools to paint. And this is probably my favorite painting from the early days of my concussion, and it's called Catbird Seat. When you have a concussion and you're home alone, you are in the unusual position for someone in this day and age that you can't look up anything. I couldn't look up anything on Google. I couldn't look in my Columbia Desk Encyclopedia. You really are suddenly taken away from that access to reference tools that we're all especially used to now in the age of Google. And the phrase catbird seat came into my head because we had bushes in the backyard where a family of catbirds had made a nest. And when I did this painting, it really made me think of that, so I wanted to call the painting Catbird Seat. And then I thought, why do we say sitting in the catbird seat? And wasn't able to look it up. And that was when I finally convinced my family that, yes, I did need an Amazon Echo. And I was able, you can say, Alexa, Wikipedia catbird seat. And she will tell you the whole story of how both the sports journalist, I think it's Red Barber, and the writer, I think, no, I'm not remembering it. Right, James Thurber, both think the other person thought of it. They both ascribed the origin of the expression catbird seat to each other, and that was quite a delightful discovery for me. This is a painting called Helen Levitt's Winter, and it is in the show. You can go look at it in the show. And there's a story behind it. When I was a senior at Princeton, as I said, I studied the history of photography, and Helen Levitt was and is one of my favorite photographers of all time. She's probably one of a handful of the greatest street photographers, certainly in the 20th century. And she came to speak at Princeton, and this would have been in the mid-'80s, at a time when color photography was very new and still seemed very kind of harsh and brassy to all of us. But she came and showed her color work. And after she gave her talk, and you have to imagine at that point she was probably at least in her 70s, this tiny little elderly, tough as nails woman. She was probably 4'10", and so she's showing her stuff, and at the end of her talk she asked if there are any questions, and as almost always happens at Princeton, after a talk, a male student stands up and has a question that is really more of a look at me, here are my thoughts, and this guy stood up and said, well, I'm just wondering, I noticed that most of your photographs, all of your photographs really, take place in the summer, the spring, and the fall. And I'm wondering what it says about your oeuvre that you don't have photographs of the New York streets during the winter. And she looked at him and she said, it's cold in New York in the winter. And he said, well, I know, but I'm just thinking, what does it say about your philosophy of photography? And he just went on. And after he finished, she let it sit there for a minute. And then she looked at him and she said, it's cold in New York in the winter. Next question. And so that's become an expression in our household. We'll sometimes just look at each other and say, it's cold in New York in the winter. And here are two examples, two of my favorite examples of Helen Levitt's black and white photography, as well as probably one of the color photographs we saw that day in her presentation. This is a close-up of a technique that I spent really not just hours but days working on. In looking at leaves and also other people's paintings, I became fascinated with this idea of combining two colors without fully mixing them together and how you could do that. And so I spent hours and hours developing a technique to do that. And as I was making this slideshow, it reminded me of a time when I was home with the concussion, and my son said to me, he wanted me to do something with him or for him, and he said, are you sure that will you have time to do that? And I looked at him and I said, buddy, I've got nothing but time. And that really was the silver lining of having a concussion, that I went from having a very intense job without a lot of free time to myself, a very busy life, to suddenly having a life where it was stripped down to its essentials. And the one thing that I had was the one thing I always felt before that I didn't have, which was all the time in the world. And that, I think, is crucial to making art, to feeling like you have this time in which you can let ideas germinate, you can experiment with things, and while I wouldn't want to go through the concussion again, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, I do feel like the gift of the experience was that gift of time. As I looked through my photographs of my paintings to decide which paintings to have in this show, and then as I was preparing the slideshow for tonight, I noticed that I have a remarkable number of paintings that were about balancing and falling. This painting is called Delicate Balance, and I have quite a few others where I took lines and then tried to figure out how to make them kind of settle on the page. And looking back on it, I think that I realized that I was working through in my painting what I was working through in my physiology, of how to balance, how to keep from falling, and how to get from where I was physiologically to where I was trying to go. And the painting on the left is called But How Do I Get There? And the painting on the right is, we numbered, Shelley and I numbered all the Concussion Diaries paintings, and it's Concussion Diaries number 79 in mid-August. And if you look in my Instagram account called the Concussion Diaries, you can see that I wrote, it occurs to me that that this is one of those images where I keep making these images about settling down, and what I said was I'm trying to paint it maybe as I am rather unsettled, so sort of trying to make it so through painting. And a friend of mine wrote back, yes, but the figures seem to be falling into place. And it was that kind of encouragement as I went through this experience that was really helpful. And one of my kind of mantras in the back of my head was something that Winston Churchill said during World War II, which was, when you are going through hell, keep going. So I really just tried to keep going. This is one of my paintings where I was experimenting with line and really trying to figure out how to take the lines and have them kind of lay down on the page, have a progression of the lines, sort of settling down on the page. But if you look at my photographs from the time, it's not surprising that this painting also struck a lot of people as quite botanical. There are two versions of this painting. This painting is called Sleeplessness, and we had gone out just before I did this painting and bought me some new paint. And I bought 4 different colors of neon paint, so just a little tiny set of neon paint, thinking that would be fun and bright and interesting. And what I discovered was that neon paint had the same effect on me as fluorescent lights. It actually made me kind of seasick. So I did a painting like this in fluorescent paints and put it up on the Instagram so everybody could see, and then tried to talk a little bit in the notes about how it made me feel. But this painting was the other painting I did that night. And these were in fact painted in the middle of the night. There were times when I just couldn't sleep and I would get up and go downstairs and paint, and it really was helpful to be able to paint through some of the challenges of this experience. And out of some of those nights of frustration and just being down in the living room, you know, working through things, some really great things came out of those nights. And this is one of my favorite paintings called Reverb, and you can see the technique that I started playing with that night when I couldn't sleep turned into this, which is a 3-foot by 5-foot painting, and using the same technique but kind of taking it a little bit farther. There were days when I was really full of despair and felt like I was trapped in a limbo that was unending, and this painting is called My Brain, after the neurologist prescribes at least another month of brain rest. And this was in early June. If you had told me at that point that I wouldn't go back to work until the 3rd week in October, it probably would have been the worst thing possible for me. It, I think, was a blessing in disguise that I had no idea how long it was going to take my brain to heal. But heal it did, and that October, this painting Blue Fog came about, and I remember when I was doing this painting feeling like the fog was a place to go into. This painting was a very three-dimensional experience for me as I was making it. I was in that place of blue fog, and even though a lot of people around me felt like, oh, she's back, she's fine, I still felt at that point, I could still tell my brain wasn't 100%, and that I was still somewhat, you know, in the blue fog. But a year later, you can see I did a painting this past October called Clarity, and you know when you're fully back, and that was the point. That was at a point where I really felt like, okay, I'm totally fine, I have my full faculties back, and now I want to keep painting. And this painting was done in July of 2018, and looking through all of my paintings, I realized that when I came out of the concussion, I was able to do paintings, and this one in particular, a painting about falling where something magical came out of the fall. I want to close with a quote from Helen Levitt, because I think it really speaks to my process as an artist and how I come at art. And she said, "It would be mistaken to suppose that any of the best photography is come at by intellection. It is, like all art, essentially the result of an intuitive process, drawing on all that the artist is rather than on anything she thinks, far less theorizes about." Thanks very much.